Hello, and welcome to Technically Biased, the podcast that discusses bias in tech. My name is Kristen Gutu, and today's guest speaker is Arslan Hidayat, who is a program director at the Campaign for Uyghurs. He graduated from the University of Western Sydney with a bachelor's degree in music and a master's degree in teaching. He used his teaching background to teach at schools and universities in Australia, Turkey, and Bahrain, and runs Talk East Turkestan, which is the most popular Facebook page and podcast highlighting the Uyghurs' plight in the English language. Given his expertise, he has been invited to share his knowledge with news media outlets such as the BBC, The Guardian, Al Jazeera, CNN, and many others. He is ethnically Uyghur, first generation Australian, so I'm interested to see your perspective. I'm very grateful for your being here today. Can you further introduce yourself, please, Arslan?
Yeah, you've done a good job of introducing me. Um, as you mentioned, born and raised in Sydney, Australia, my parents had left what we refer to as East Turkestan right after Mao Zedong died. And so the first opportunity that they got their passports and got the hell out of there. Unfortunately, the human rights atrocities have not gotten better. In fact, they've gotten worse. And now, since the active genocide in 2017, I've been initially part-time advocating for the Uyghur people, and now for the past 2 years, full-time working at the Campaign for Uyghurs, advocating for the basic human rights of Uyghurs suffering crimes against humanity and genocide by the Chinese government.
And you mentioned an important note that things escalated around
Mhm.
2017. So, from my understanding, this oppression has been going on for more than the last 2 decades. But can you share how it evolved throughout the 2000s and what exactly is going on in China?
Yeah, so we can go a little further back to give a bit more context to your audience. Now, the Uyghurs and the Chinese have been at it for a couple of hundred years, if not longer. Since so the word the for example, if we even were to go back to labels and names, the what our land or our homeland is called at the moment, the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. So the word Xinjiang actually means new frontier, new land. And this name was given to us in 1884 when the Qing dynasty under the Manchu Empire took over. And that name sort of stuck with us over the last almost 150 years. And we've been under various Chinese empires, Qing Empire, the Chinese nationalists, and now with the Chinese Communist Party. We did see a brief time of independence in 1933 and 1944. We did have our own independent state. And so from 1949, the Chinese Communist Party comes into play and takes over the Uyghur region, or East Turkestan as we label it. And, under Mao's rule, you had the Cultural Revolution, as they call it, or the Great Leap Forward, but it was actually the Great Leap Backward. And we don't know the actual numbers, but the numbers that died during Mao's time, sort of dwarfs Hitler's Nazi Germany. I don't like to make that comparison, but there are comparisons talking about numbers reaching into the 50 to 60 millions of not just Uyghurs dying, but the Chinese themselves and other ethnic groups. And then after Mao died, there was a sort of lessening of policies, meaning there was a little bit of freedom where Uyghurs and other groups could sort of come up with ideas, a bit of religious freedom. But then there was this underlying still oppression going on. So, for example, in the early 90s, well, in the late 70s, early 80s, you saw the implementation of China's one-child policy and two-child policy for so-called ethnic minorities. This policy really ramped up in the early 90s, where Uyghurs actually stood up to the government saying, you cannot abort our children, you cannot sterilize our women, because according to China's rule, you were only allowed to have one or two children with regards to the so-called ethnic minorities. And so we guesstimate that millions of Uyghur children had been genocided in that manner. Especially when we get to the beginning of the 2000s, we have the anniversary of the September 11 attacks coming up. China very much used that as an excuse to further clamp down or crack down on Uyghurs, saying that, look, we've got Muslims in our borders, we've got extremists in our borders, and we're going to implement tough regulations against Muslims. And so they use an excuse to clamp down on very normal practices of Uyghurs. So normal religious practices. So you're praying, wearing of certain religious clothing, whether it be headscarves or having beards, taking part in religious activities such as fasting during the month of Ramadan, going to the Hajj pilgrimage, saying simple terminology like Assalamu alaikum, like very simple things that Muslims in the West, in the free world, can do, was, stamped out in China, in East Turkestan. And so, but that really got cracked down post 2016, 2017, where those religious practices were sort of half banned, and then they were really, really banned after 2017. So that's a very, very quick summary of what's been happening since 2000, so to speak.
So you gave a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
So before I move on to my next question, I also want to include that in addition to the ethnic oppression, Western China is heavy in oil, heavy in water. It has
Yes.
3/4 of China's water, so it's known as the water basin. So this kind of adds fuel to the fire and reason for China to be in the position where it's oppressing the Uyghurs. You mentioned sterilization, and I think that's very important because, under my impression, that is still happening today, where the Uyghur women are forced to take birth control and, in extreme cases, are given forced sterilization. Can you touch on that and the different ways that China oppresses the Uyghurs based on their gender? Because, of course, men are also oppressed differently.
Yeah, so the policing of Uyghur women's bodies is very scary, a troubling aspect, and that's been highlighted in a lot of reports and testimonials. The Chinese government does have severe measures to control and restrict the Uyghur women's reproductive rights and personal choices. As you mentioned, forced sterilization, coerced birth control methods, and widespread campaigns to limit Uyghur population growth. So Uyghur women are subjected to intrusive medical examinations, pressure to use IUDs, and receive sterilization surgeries. In our line of work, we interview Uyghur women who have gone through this. I had the experience of interviewing a Uyghur medical doctor who was forced to take part in these. But when she was in the hospital, when you grow up in that system, you don't realize that you're committing a crime, being part of the genocide. And she had told me, this woman, for example, that I'm talking about now, she now resides in Turkey, but she later on sort of continued her work in Turkey. And when some Uyghur women came to her and hadn't even realized that their reproductive organs, sorry, not the actual organ, but the organs, for example, fallopian tubes, uteruses, these women had hysterectomies. They could no longer have children, and they didn't even realize that such an operation had happened to them. So she was telling me that Uyghur women would be brought in droves to a hospital. They would complete these operations, taking out reproductive organs, the ability to have children. And these Uyghur women, they didn't even realize, because they were put under, they were taught that they had to go through a normal sort of gynecological checkup. And they woke up not realizing that they no longer could have children. And obviously there are, within the camps themselves, Uyghur women are given drugs and they no longer have periods. They are put into zombie-like states and they don't know what's really going on. And in these camps, we have heard that they torture these women through rape, sexual harassment. There's the testimony of a prominent Uyghur former camp detainee, Tursne Ziawuddin, saying that she was abused in her genitalia with electric buttons. And so I don't know how much I want to go on, telling your audience this, but it's very, very horrific.
And the horror extends in the sense that you mentioned that the doctor herself was a Uyghur. And I
Yes.
think that's important to highlight because of the indoctrination that's going on. So, can you elaborate on how China teaches students to turn against their parents, employees to turn against one another, and this environment of untrust that you don't know whom to trust if you can trust anyone?
So on paper, China allows for various religions such as Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and various forms of Buddhism to be practiced. But in reality, you are not allowed to do that because these religions are seen as the other. These religions compete against atheistic, communistic beliefs. And so from a very young age, you are taught the religion of communism. The Chinese Communist Party is your church, and the leader, whoever the president or whoever the general secretary is of the Communist Party, is literally your God. So in these camps, especially, you are forced to recompense or give out the sins that you committed and write it out on a piece of paper and send this to the Chinese Communist Party. And the more that you do so, you are less punished. You are taught from a very young age, again, everything that you do is being watched, regardless of whether it actually is. That notion, we have a saying in the Uyghur language saying that these four walls have ears. So from a very young age, we are told to report on each other, because if you do not report, then you yourself will end up in trouble. Or if you do not report, then again, someone else will report on you that you did not report when someone was talking about certain ideologies that go against the Chinese Communist Party. So in these camps, they really wanted to stamp that out because through other means, they weren't quite successful in the schools. When you mention children, the children are not necessarily taught to go against or report on their parents. What happens is the parents would, back in the day, conduct religious activities or talk about the Uyghur culture or Uyghur identity. So this was being taught in the homes. Now, when you're a child, when you're 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, and the teacher asks you, what do you guys talk about at home during dinner? The child doesn't know that he's supposed to keep certain information censored to protect his family. He'll go, well, my father taught me how to pray. My mother taught me how to act in a certain way in certain situations. And from that testimony from children, then the teacher goes ahead and reports it to her superiors, and then it gets those children in trouble. So now, because a lot of these testimonies from children, now you see these children being taken away from their parents and being put into state-run orphanages to further brainwash them into perfect Chinese communist atheist citizens. It doesn't stop there. Then you've got, and I will elaborate on what we were talking about a moment ago with the Uyghur women, then the Uyghur women are also forced to marry Han Chinese men. It's to dilute the population. You would have seen such practice. I mean, I'm an Australian. We learned about this briefly with in Australia, we had something called the White Australia policy. And this continued from the early 1900s, and it only ended about towards the end of the 1960s, where we have something called the stolen generation, where Aboriginal children were taken off and brought up in white homes, and they were brought up to accept white culture. And very much China, that's what China is doing today. So that's, in a nutshell, that's what's been going on.
And there's so many layers to it because you mention you're saying that these walls have ears.
Yep.
And I think many cultures have a similar saying.
Mhm.
What I think takes China's aggression to another level is that they also have eyes now. You know, China is so technologically advanced, we don't even know to the extent, but
Yep.
we do know that the government is close to the top surveillance companies.
Mhm.
And so some of the things that I was shocked to read was that these Uyghur families genuinely have a camera in their living rooms. So they are being watched as they watch TV, or they have their cards that they constantly have to scan to get in and out of their neighborhoods and constant police checkpoints. So, can you touch a little about how the police checkpoints work, how their neighborhoods are so gated, and also this trustworthy ranking that they are assigned or not assigned based on how they cooperate with China's regulations?
Yeah. Would you be shocked if I tell you that having a security camera in your home is actually much better than having actual Chinese officials live with you? Because if you can look this up, 1.1 million Chinese officials at any given time, if not more, live with Uyghur homes and surveillance them in a physical manner, reporting on what they talk about, if they use the Chinese language sufficiently enough, how they eat, what they talk to their children about. So initially, when these camps were full throttle, the men were taken in and women were left alone at home with their kids. And essentially, we had a lot of reports of these Chinese officials raping the women, and they were reporting back on how they would take over their household. And you can find these videos on social media as well. Sort of the Chinese officials sleeping with the women just a few minutes before they actually turn off the lights and sleep, that they're in the same bed. And so again, I actually wouldn't mind having a security camera rather than having Chinese officials living with me and eating with me and scrutinizing everything that I do and reporting back to their superiors. With regards to the police checkpoints, the police checkpoints are also quite scary. They're often referred to as convenience police stations. They've been set up in cities and towns throughout East Turkestan. And what they say is they use these measures to combat terrorism, separatism, and extremism, the three evils, they call them. These police checkpoints are equipped with high-tech surveillance systems, including facial recognition cameras. They monitor movements and activities of the Uyghurs. They are subjected to, Uyghurs especially, are subjected to intense scrutiny. So they mainly target the Uyghurs. So whenever the Han people, the Chinese people walk through, they're not checked. So whilst they're being checked, their ID documents, their phones, their personal belongings, and they even at times, if not most of the time, go through a strip search.
And from my understanding, they have these checkpoints, but
Mhm.
then in addition to these checkpoints, the Uyghur community also has to scan their ID when they go to the grocery store, when they go
Yep.
to the gas station, before they enter their neighborhood, they can't leave.
Yep.
Is there any getting around it, or it's
No,
truly
yeah. So for example, there's something called the Integrated Joint Operations Platform,
Mhm.
IJOP, and this is used by the government to target Uyghurs. So this system that they have in their phones, right, allows real-time tracking and surveillance of their everyday activities, their movement, communications, social interactions. I mean, a lot of data is collected in the biometric info. So through this system, they can identify individuals who deviate from their norms. So even like such and such is leaving his house from his front door rather than his back door. Or this month, this person or this household is using more electricity than last month. Have they got some power tools that they're using, or perhaps that they're using less electricity? They're using more water this month than last month. or how much gas they're using, a lot more gas in their car than last month. So every single part of your behavior, how you behave, how you interact. Hold on, this person, because now they've got facial recognition and AI, this person is acting more sad than last month. What's happening? Or is a little more angry. Like all of this, like it's literally something out of a movie, but all of this is supposedly able to be tracked and recorded in these apps.
And
Yeah,
it's scary to think about because China also uses neurotechnology on their students, regardless of the background. So even the Han Chinese.
yeah,
And so they're learning how their brainwaves function, how they react, what distracts them, how quickly they get distracted. And so this is to keep, quote unquote, their people in line.
yeah.
But then, of course, how much more abusive does it get when they're using such technology to oppress a people? And another point I want to make, because we're thinking externally, okay, they're watching us with cameras. But my understanding is that WeChat is also a very crucial app that it needs to be used for day-to-day life in
Yeah.
China, and that this is also can be monitored. Do you know anything about that as well?
Yeah, so WeChat is the equivalent of Apple Pay, Google Maps, WhatsApp, Instagram, sort of all in one, sort of like an all in one app. It's almost like, your Google apps, but in one app. So WeChat is definitely closely monitored by the government, and it has, significant implications for, users' privacy and freedom of expression. Um, Initially it was, just a normal social media app, sort of like WhatsApp. You share photos and videos, but now it's very much encompasses all the other tools that I've just mentioned above. Now it's used as a surveillance tool, both domestically and internationally. So, and you can't really talk about anything. So, if you were to say type in sort of these censored terminology, like for example, Tiananmen Square, or you typed in July 5th, Urumqi, you typed in even certain words, you typed in the word COVID and things like this, it would automatically be censored and you'd get a knock on your door, because you and I can right now open up a Facebook account, Instagram account, YouTube account, and we could totally have just like a make up a name. But in China, to open up any sort of social media account like WeChat, it has to be linked to your government ID. So no one can talk freely. And if they do criticize the government in any way, they're going to know who made a post. And not, and these aren't just public posts. Even the private conversations that you have, or the video conversations that you have, just one-on-one, it's supposed to be encrypted, but they can track that as well. Nothing is private.
And not only is nothing private, but then even if you are a stand-up character, if they
Mhm.
have any suspicions, there is predictive policing.
Yeah.
So can you talk about, I'm not sure if I'm saying their name right, Chen Quango's role in introducing predictive policing and how this further incriminates Uyghurs that may have done absolutely nothing wrong?
Yeah. So let's talk about what predictive policing is. So if people have watched sort of Minority Report, they're trying to guess, a crime this person may commit in the future. And people are being locked up and being given long-term sentences for this. So for example, my own family members, right? My mother-in-law, my father-in-law, who are close to their 60s, and my two brothers-in-law are pretty much locked up for the past 6 or 7 years, specifically for this reason, because apparently they had thoughts to commit terrorist acts, and millions of Uyghurs are put into this for this very reason. So what they apparently do is they collect personal information, again, like the apps like through iJob. check your social media, travel history, financial and other things they say. And again, through the surveillance, through the AI, checking your facial recognition, they think they can guess, well, not just guess, but they think they're, pretty much 90 to 100% sure that such and such person is going to commit terrorist activities because of certain information. So Chen Changguo is a Chinese politician who was the head or the chief of the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region in like sort of mid-August 2016. He was the one that introduced the camps in the region, and he's known for implementing this predictive policing. He, before coming to the Uyghur region, he was the head back in Tibet. And there was a much smaller version of what he was doing in Tibet that we now see in the Uyghur region. So a lot of the predictive policing, the re-education camps, sort of also there was a much like a guinea pig version of it in Tibet. And then there was a full-fledged version in the Uyghur region from 2016 till today.
And what's so scary to think about everything that you just shared, which is horrifying, and I'm sorry to hear that, is that I as an American, and you're living in DC now, is that correct?
That's right. Yeah.
So it's very easy to create this us versus them mentality where, oh, it's not happening to us, it's not our concern. But then we even have predictive policing that's now starting to seep into America. And it was, I think, in 2021 where the Chicago Police Department used a similar approach where they approached a man named Robert McDaniel and they said, our algorithm told us that you are likely to be in a shooting. They didn't know if he would be the shooter or if he would be the one being shot, but they approached him and they are constantly watching him, just saying, we want you to know we're watching.
Wow.
Because the different gangs in Chicago saw him talking to the police, they thought he was an informant and he got shot.
Oh, wow.
And not only did this happen once, but the police refused to leave him alone. And so he got shot a second time.
Wow.
And so it's this idea where it's happening everywhere. We see it in Myanmar with the oppression of the Rohingya Muslim community. And we see it being perpetuated differently, but it's always towards minority groups. And so my next question is there anything else that we might not be aware of that they're using this data besides predictive policing or besides stealing these people from their homes and shipping them to concentration camps? How else should we be aware of how this data is being used and manipulated?
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? I'm sure you've heard about China stealing technology and using it as their own. So a lot of the Chinese apps or the companies that we talk about, initially, a lot of these apps were actually invented. They were birthed in the US, but because of US law, you couldn't really implement any of this technology. And so China took it, rehashed it, and China doesn't have the privacy laws that the US has. And I guess you could sort of argue, well, the US are doing it anyway, and you could sort of get into Edward Snowden and everything, but we won't get into that. But we can now see this technology, China selling it to various South American countries, some countries in the continent of Africa as well. So some tyrannical countries in these continents, I'm obviously not labeling the whole continent, I'm not putting a label, but some tyrannical regimes around the world are very much adopting the same measures that China has. So you mentioned the Rohingya. It's Chinese technology, Chinese construction, and Chinese weapons that have allowed for this group to be oppressed. Yeah, so this is definitely spreading around the world. I would say overall, as a human race, we are losing more privacy. We are losing more of our rights every day because of this technology. And I worry that, like China has used terrorism and extremism and separatism as a reason for this technology, for other regimes or even some what we deem to think freedom-loving or democratic countries to enact some of this or to implement some of this for a greater good, so to speak.
And you mentioned Africa, and of course, it's a large continent, but the
Yeah,
relationship that China has there.
yeah.
And this was evident in 2016 when China said, oh, we'll give Egypt over $11 billion
Mm-hmm.
for infrastructure projects, but you have to return all of the Uyghur
Yeah.
people that have escaped China to Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
And we saw tens of thousands of Uyghurs being sent back to China. And another concern is I know China was working with Zimbabwe
Yeah.
for, again, a trade-off. We'll share the technology we build with Zimbabwe if Zimbabwe shares their facial data with China, since China does not have training data on Black people. So it's very terrifying, and I think it's very underrated how far-reaching China is and how quiet they are about going about all of this.
Yeah, I'm not sure with the exact number of the Uyghurs who were actually sent back to China. I don't think it was in the tens of thousands, but I sort of had to look that up. The number is high. Yeah, it is quite scary. So I'll put it in a few words to sort of cover all that. Is China's debt trap diplomacy. So, as you mentioned, this is a strategic policy employed by the Chinese government to extend its economic and political influence over these countries through debt. So, the approach is, as you mentioned, providing loans to develop sort of second or third world countries, as you mentioned, infrastructure projects. And the aim of this is to gain leverage and secure access to resources and potentially exert control over these borrowing nations. So we mentioned, infrastructure investments. So they're building railways, they're building ports, they're building highways, they're building plants. And so what they'll, these loans, these countries are not going to be able to pay them back. So they go, you know what? We'll control this port for 99 years. Give us a lease, and we'll control it. So it's another form of colonialism. They're not going in with guns and ships and bombs, but they're through money they are taking over these countries. They're giving these debts that these countries are not going to be able to pay back. And now we're seeing payback time, asset siege and control. In some cases, where countries they're unable to pay the debt back, and so China takes over the ports that they gave. And you mentioned Zimbabwe, and especially another big thing is they'll give this money or they'll build these things for them or they'll give them technology. So when it comes to major decisions at, say, the United Nations, certain resolutions are going to be put against China because of the crimes that they've committed against the Uyghurs or whatever other group. These countries who are indebted to China are going to vote for China.
Mhm.
So that's another big way of, China controlling the narrative in the world, especially at these world forums like the United Nations, at the human rights councils.
So twofold, you are correct. According to Al Jazeera, it's estimated that it was 7 to 8 thousand that were
Yeah.
sent back from Egypt.
Oh,
My
wow.
apologies.
No, that's okay. Yeah. Yeah.
My next point, so you mentioned how China manipulates the narrative.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to differentiate between technology and
Mhm.
social media.
Yeah.
So, can you touch on how social media is used to structure the narrative and why you think there's not more awareness?
Well, the main thing is we simply cannot go on the ground. It's not like other places where, like the Rohingya or say in Palestine or wherever there's an oppression, there is news media on the ground there. The people there have access to
Mhm.
Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Twitter. They're live posting what's going on. That's one of the main reasons. And now, again, in a war of narratives, the main government, the main country that is sort of standing up for the Uyghurs is the United States. And a lot of people are skeptical because of the US war on terror. You sort of bombed some countries back to the Stone Age, and now you want to stand up for Muslims here. What's your agenda? Now, we understand that all countries have national interests. It just so happens that the genocide, which is real, has in line with US national interests. And so, therefore, there is this misinformation. And because no one can actually go to the ground and do independent investigation, there is always a cloud of doubt to the veracity of actually what's going on in the ground.
And it makes me think of the Sri Lankan genocide on the Tamil community, which is still being denied despite, I will say, I think it's tens of thousands, maybe over 100,000, I think, but I will have to fact check. But so many missing people again that they have no response for where they went. And we have so many families saying, well, we just never spoke to these people again, which seems to be heartbreakingly the case with the Uyghur people. And so my next question is, if there is so much misinformation, which is the case today, and it is so difficult to get information out, then how can people such as myself that want to educate ourselves, how can we find resources that we can trust to do so?
Yeah, so there are prominent human rights organizations. I would go directly, first of all, to the Uyghur rights groups that are covering this on a daily basis. I mean, we at Campaign for Uyghurs, we cover this on a daily basis on our website, on our social media. Other prominent human rights organizations, Amnesty International, globally recognized human rights organization, they've investigated heavily on the Uyghur genocide. Human Rights Watch, which we've all heard about. The United Nations Human Rights Council, they have some reports. And last year, we're actually coming on the anniversary in a couple of days. They released a report in 2022, August 31, saying that China's crimes may amount to crimes against humanity. There's a thorough report there. Follow the US State Department website. And then you've also got, the impeccable work of reports coming from the BBC, Reuters, Associated Press, Al Jazeera, with lots of references. I mean, and you could sort of argue that, it's just Western propaganda, but, Al Jazeera, there's a lot of Eastern media outlets as well that have been covering this. We know it's covered in a lot of Indian media, the Hong Kong Free Press. So lots of sources still for you to go to, regardless of the sort of the misinformation out there.
You mentioned Al Jazeera. I love Al Jazeera, so I trust their news. So we covered a lot. And so for my final question, it's more open-ended. It's more, what should we be aware of that a lot of the Western world is unaware of? And also, how can we do our part, not just by educating ourselves, but by raising awareness, by trying to provoke policy through the UN? Who knows? What would you suggest we can do or we should be made aware of?
One, don't treat China like a normal country. It's definitely not. And again, I'm not over exaggerating.
No,
We've
you're not.
seen the certain documentaries when we hear about North Korea. It literally is North Korea, just with a lot more money. And it's a bit, you can sort of travel to China, so to speak. So for example, big argument, LGBTQIA, right? It's illegal for you to be LGBTQIA in China. You'll be thrown in prison. It'll be beaten out of you. When we have the pro-choice or pro-life discussions that we have in the West, we just saw the women's rights that I've just talked about, forced sterilization, forced marriages, forced rapes, forced abortions. When we talk about the internet, Chinese people don't have an internet. They have an intranet. For you to use a VPN to jump over the Chinese firewall it's a second-degree terrorism charge. You can look this up. And we do go through, some human rights violations in the West, whether you're in the United States or Europe or Australia, we do have it. But there is an avenue for you to protest without being thrown into prison. There is an avenue to sort of voice your concerns about, so hypothetically, I'm an Australian citizen, my mum lives in Australia, right? And I've come to the United States, and then I start complaining to the United States government, hey, you know what? In Australia, we're going through this. I'm not going to be worried about my mum who lives in Sydney, Australia, getting a knock on the door from Australian police. It's a totally different kettle of fish. You cannot compare it. As for what you can do, especially with the tools that we have with technology, citizen journalism, sharing this stuff on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, talking about it with your family, your friends. If you're a student in university, write a paper on it, the different aspects of this genocide, online activism, hashtags. If you've got connections with government officials or MPs or senators, petitions and letters. I mean, there's so much that we can do to do our bit in highlighting it. And the most simple thing, forced labor, right? So we haven't talked about this, but China is actually profiting off the Uyghurs, because you're not going to make any money just by housing or putting people into concentration camps. You're going to put them to use, right? You're going to make them make our Nike shoes, the clothes, our technology. So do your best to avoid buying made in China goods. We're very lucky in the United States. There's something called the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act that's been enacted, and now we see a lot more less made in China goods, but Chinese goods are still getting through the loophole. With social media sites like Shein, there's something called the de minimis loophole, where any goods under $800 are not checked at the border, and then these goods that could be tainted with the Uyghur forced labor still get through. So do at your very best avoid buying made in China goods, because every penny that you spend, you could be knowingly or unknowingly being complicit in this genocide.
Thank you for mentioning the forced labor, because I intended to mention that, but there was so much to discuss today. I want to thank you for your insight, for everything you shared, and to our listeners, thank you for listening, and stay tuned for another episode of Technically Biased, the podcast that discusses bias in tech. Have a good day, everyone.